with the weary, rhythmic pulse of a man hauling the kinetic mass of 1,000 systems in his wake. Emperor Grixnar the Sixth carved a path through the vaulted ribs of his cage. He breached the antechamber, a void pressurized by silence and the guttering, amber radiation of dying carbon. A heat sink of stillness amidst the sprawling, entropic rot of the palace. With a sharp, serrated snap of his jewel-encrusted wrist, a gesture ripped from the core of absolute sovereignty, he signaled the meat puppets of his elite guard to withdraw. They offered no protest, no flicker of digital curiosity. They merely executed a synchronized collapse of posture, their armor grinding a metallic dirge against the floor as they bled back into the dark. They retreated with the heavy, low-level dread of men who understood that the coming hour was not indexed for the lowly, that the data bursts about to be shared were of a nature so corrosive that to record them was to invite a terminal system crash. Alone in the pressurized quiet of the tomb, the Emperor turned his focus to a crystal decanter, the fuel within shimmering like the output of a dying pulsar. With the cold, binary precision of a surgical bot, he poured 2 measures of the spirit, the splash against glass the only heartbeat in the room. He hauled the vessels to a low table, a neutral interface between 2 deep, velvet-lined chairs, thrones for the soul rather than the sleeve. He docked one glass with a hollow click before the empty seat and slumped his own frame into the other, his biological substrate seeking refuge in the upholstery's embrace. There he remained, digits tracing a rhythmic orbit to swirl the liquor, his optics locked with a predatory intensity upon the shifting, iridescent filth dancing in the glass, toxic violets and deep, arterial crimsons swirling in a kaleidoscopic storm that mirrored the recursive glitches of his own mind. Then, without the protest of a floorboard or the rustle of a curtain, the room's vacuum was filled. The ghost was suddenly local. "May you live forever, my Emperor," came the voice, a low-frequency rasp that carried the grit of ancient dust and the monomolecular edge of a blade. From the velvet-black shadows behind the heavy shrouds, a hooded figure upscaled into reality like a virus conjured from the palace architecture. Grixnar didn't twitch, nor did he reach for the steel at his hip. He had felt this voice echoing in the dead sectors of his dreams long before the man finally peeled back the heavy fabric of his cowl to reveal the scarred, weathered hardware of his face. With a tired but fluid motion, the Emperor indicated the waiting chair and the untouched chemical payload, a parley offered between 2 apex predators of the state. Chief Intelligence Officer Quartelva bridged the floor with the silent, predatory grace of a feline, his boots making 0 noise on the polished stone. He sat, jacked his frame into the seat, and lifted the glass, his optics widening as the light hit the vintage. "Kazravelian liquor," he whispered, the words a prayer to high-end consumption. "You spoil me, my Emperor. You offer me the nectar of gods while we tally the meat count of mere mortals." The Emperor let the stillness hang, the sharp, medicinal stench of the ethanol filling the gap between them like a firewall before he broke the silence. He asked the question that had been eating his resolve like a persistent piece of malware. "Have you finished the harvest on the humans, Quor?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying the subharmonic hum of desperation. He leaned into the light, the golden circuitry of his robes flickering, his gaze searching the shadow-haunted senses of his advisor for a sign, a patch, or the final confirmation of the nightmare creeping in from the galactic rim. Quartelva didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a breath so deep it seemed he meant to drain the room of oxygen, then vented it slowly, a long, mournful exhaust that signaled the arrival of a heavy truth. "I have, my Emperor," he began, his voice taking on a heavy, rhythmic gravity, "and the report is a fragging horror show. They are more terrifying, more fundamentally broken in their design, than our scouts dared to upload." He paused for the beat, letting the cold dread sink into the Emperor's marrow. "They aren't just soldiers, my magnificence. They are biological weapon systems with 2 distinct, jarring settings. Imagine a metaphysical toggle switch buried in the prefrontal cortex. The default mode, the one they use to mask their nature, is the over-friendly neighbor, a creature delighted to share resources, to help you bridge a gap, to ensure your comfort with a disarming smile. But, he warned, his voice dropping into a chilling, low-bit register, if you trip the sensor, if you violate their inscrutable sense of order, they flip. They become ruthless, merciless slaughter engines, unblinking avatars of carnage who will not cease, will not glitch, and will not abort the sequence until you have been deleted from the census of the living. The Emperor fell back into his chair, the velvet offering no buffer against the cold data Quartelva had injected into his world. A shadow of profound concern flickered across his regal features, his brow furrowing as he contemplated the volatile architecture of this bipedal race. "And do we know," he began, his voice a measured rumble that echoed the instability of his own heart. "Do we possess the code, the insight, or the bypass to understand what trips this switch? What catalyst, what singular act of provocation, causes the friendly neighbor to de-res and the engine of annihilation to spool up in its place?" Quartelva leaned into the dim, amber light, his weathered face becoming a topographic map of hard decisions. "It is a complex tapestry of biological imperatives, my Emperor, for the trigger is as varied and as individual as the stacks themselves. It is a spark that resides in the unique furnace of each human sleeve. However," he continued, his voice taking on the sonorous tone of a scholar deliver a dark prophecy, "when we look upon them as a collective hive, there are certain transgressions that act as a master key. There are acts so foul, so contrary to their peculiar hardwiring, that they are guaranteed to summon the monster. I speak of injustice, that cold perversion of fairness. I speak of bullying, that cruel exercise of power over the weak. And, most significantly, I speak of attacking the vulnerable." He paused, his optics narrowing with a visceral intensity. "Specifically, my magnificence, they are at their most aggressive, their most primal, and their most terrifying if you have dared to damage their cubs. It matters not if they are their own biological progeny or the cubs of an alien sleeve. To harm the young is to invite a fury that knows no cooling cycle. They possess a concept, a sacred and terrible boundary they call the theater of war. It is a code they hold in high esteem, a rule they broke but once during a global cataclysm they refer to as a world war. In that dark era, they turned their weapons upon the non-augmented, the non-combatants, and the memory of that depravity has seared itself into their collective drive. They were so repulsed, so utterly horrified by their own capacity for such rot, that they have sworn an unwritten oath never to repeat it. They prefer the clean, albeit brutal, meeting of meat to meat, blade to blade, heart to heart. To them, children, even the children of their most hated adversaries, are the ultimate non-combatants, a sanctuary of innocence that must remain untouched by the flames of conflict. The Emperor took a slow, contemplative sip of his liquor, the liquid burning down his throat with a heat that matched the intensity of the report. He looked out into the dim recesses of the tomb, his voice soft but resonant with a strange, burgeoning respect. "That sounds like a brand of honor," he murmured, the word hanging in the air like a fragile peace offering. He found himself moved by the irony that a race so capable of devastation could tether their biological substrate to such a profound and self-imposed moral anchor. "Indeed, my Emperor, it is a brand of honor that borders on the spiritual," Quartelva replied, his hands moving in a graceful, explanatory arc for even in the white-hot crucible of the meat grinder. Even when the air is thick with the scent of ozone and the screams of the dying, they will maintain their mask of friendliness to those they deem non-combatants. This compassion extends even to the wounded soldiers who, but a microsecond prior, were seeking their very lives. It is a sight that defies military logic. In the chaotic heart of a battlefield, should they discover civilians caught in the crossfire, helpless entities trapped in the grinding gears of the struggle, they will not hesitate to split their force. They will peel away their soldiers, divert their precious munitions, and splinter their tactical focus in order to shepherd those innocents to safety. They will do this, my Emperor, even at the cost of their tactical advantage, and even while risking their own sleeves in a display of altruism that is as breathtaking as it is illogical. The Emperor set his glass down, the click of crystal against wood sharp as a gavel. His eyes were wide, reflecting a deep, strategic confusion that gnawed at his centuries of military heritage. "That does not sound like a sensible military strategy," he observed, his voice tinged with the skepticism of a conqueror who had spent a lifetime studying the cold mathematics of victory and defeat. To him, the diversion of resources in the heat of combat was a heresy against the very nature of command. Quartelva leaned closer, the shadows of the tomb seeming to bleed into the light as he prepared to deliver a truth that defied the binary logic of imperial doctrine. "But that, my magnificence, is the central horror of the human condition. the primary subroutine that keeps our tactical algorithms in a state of terminal paralysis. They do not fight a war to secure a sector or seize a resource. They do not view the front line as a tally of terraformed rock or top-lamented bunkers. No, my Emperor, they fight a war in order to end the concept of war itself. They wield destruction like a monomolecular scalpel, praying that one agonizing incision will cauterize the need for a century of bleeding. The Emperor's hand froze, the glass halfway to his lips as his mind grappled with the sheer, paradoxical mass of that data. He looked at Cortelva with a piercing, predatory stare, his voice hushed and heavy with the hum of existential dread. "Explain the mechanism," he commanded, the words echoing like a funeral bell in the silent vault. They do not view conflict as a localized event, nor as a temporary friction between systems, Cortelva explained, his voice rising with a rhythmic, hard-boiled intensity. They view it as a singular, critical failure in the network of history. So, they execute the current war with such unbridled, visceral commitment, with such total, entropic focus, that it becomes fundamentally impossible for any survivor to ever contemplate a reload. If the objective requires driving an entire lineage to the silent, frozen edge of extinction, they will initiate the sequence. If it demands acts of such unspeakable violence that the stars themselves would turn cold, they will execute without a flicker of latency or a gram of remorse. In short, my Emperor, for the humans, war is a grand, horrific theater designed to shatter the enemy's psyche so completely that peace becomes the only survivable OS. "I see," the Emperor whispered, his voice barely cutting through the static of his own thoughts. He stared into the dark, swirling sewage of his drink, seeing not just vintage, but the shadows of a galaxy reconfigured by such a brutalist philosophy. The threat was no longer a military variable. It was a fundamental shift in the physics of power. "It gets worse, my Emperor," Cortelva continued, his voice dropping to a low-frequency murmur. "Because they are fighting for the total erasure of future conflict, they accept casualty rates and loss margins that would turn the stomach of any civilized general in our history. They do not fear the Reaper. They have mapped his genome. They will willingly, even eagerly, burn their own sleeves to cinders if they believe the heat will take their enemy into the void with them. If they are fighting for that volatile, high-stakes concept they call freedom, they will happily delete their entire species, leaving behind nothing but a scorched, silent sector, rather than submit to the yoke. They would rather be a memory of fire than a living race of slaves. This absolute contempt for the sanctity of the sleeve translates into a tactical reality that is pure nightmare, my Emperor. It means their line infantry don't enter the theater of war for the combat. They don't hunt for survival, for glory, or for the prospect of an extraction. They drop into the meat grinder with a singular, terminal purpose: to tally exactly how many souls they can drag into the abyss before their own substrate fails. They are the accountants of the grave, the talliers of the dead. They have turned slaughter into a dark sport, holding competitions to see who can claim the highest body count before their own light goes out. In short, my magnificence, they do not fight for a tactical win or a piece of high ground. They fight to inflict a level of pain so visceral, so absolute, that the mere memory of opposing them becomes a psychological trauma that prevents any future aggression. The Emperor exhaled a breath he hadn't realized was locked in his chest, a low hiss of air that seemed to carry the last of his warmth into the tomb. He looked at his hands, steady but feeling suddenly like fragile porcelain against the weight of this report. "This is a terminal dataset," he remarked, his voice flat with the realization that the old pillars of his reign were being systematically demolished by the mere existence of these bipeds. Cortelva's expression remained as inscrutable as the stone walls, but his optics held a flicker of something like pity. "But there is another layer of rot, my Emperor," he said, the words falling like leaden weights into the silence. Grixnar's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as if trying to scan for a glitch in reality. "Worse?" he spat, his voice rising in an incredulous spike. He found it difficult to imagine a depth of terror greater than a species that treated its own extinction as an acceptable trade-off for a psychological victory. "I am afraid so, my magnificence. For everything I have described, the carnage, the sacrifice, the calculated brutality, represents but a single setting in the human machine. And as chilling as the first setting is, The second setting is, in its own way, even more terrifying, more insidious, and harder to bypass. It is the setting that conquers without firing a single shot. Quantify the threat, the Emperor demanded. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of his throne with such white-knuckled pressure that the antique would groaned. He searched the chief intelligence officer's face for a trace of a glitch, a shadow of exaggeration, or the signs of a mind finally broken by the dark vacuum of the rim. But he found only the cold, unyielding clarity of a verified report. The idea that a species could possess a weapon more potent than the suicidal, vengeful fury he had just processed seemed to violate the basic laws of empire. It is the first setting I mentioned, my Emperor, the over-friendly, over-helpful galactic neighbor. You must understand, my magnificence, that this state of being is not a social grace or a cultural aesthetic. It is a masterfully engineered virus. Their primary strategy is to make you so utterly dependent on their presence, and to make the state of peace with them so overwhelmingly beneficial, that you lose the very capacity to contemplate a conflict. It is a grand strategy of conquering with kindness, a velvet glove that hides not a fist, but a permanent, suffocating embrace. Grixnar's grip on the chair loosened slightly, his expression shifting from dread to a flickering, skeptical irony. He let out a short, dry sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That sounds like a reprieve," he remarked, the words feeling thin and fragile. He thought of his treasury, of his overextended borders, and of the endless administrative rot. A neighbor that solved problems instead of creating them felt, for a fleeting microsecond, like an escape. "That is the brilliance of the payload, my Emperor," Quartelva countered, his optics flashing with the dark excitement of a man describing a perfect trap. "It is a slow-acting poison marketed as a cure." They initiate the sequence with a small gesture, assistance in a crisis, a trade of technology, a fix for a minor logistical glitch. Before your sensors have even logged the shift, you find yourself dependent on their networks, their data streams, and their goodwill. You have, without a single casualty, assimilated human traits into your very OS. It starts with a simple trade deal, and before you know it, your citizens are consuming their chemical stimulants, adopting their idioms, and wasting their processing power on cat videos. They delete your ability to separate your destiny from theirs, making the integration so seamless that you walk into the cage with a smile on your face. The Emperor stood up, pacing the small confines of the tomb, the golden circuitry of his robes flickering against the stone floor. He stopped and looked at Quartelva, the logic of the endgame finally clicking into place. "So," he said, his voice flat with the weight of finality, "they have engineered a reality with no exit. They either delete you in the fires of war, or they overwrite you with the honey of peace. Regardless of the path, the output remains immutable. You are conquered." "Exactly, my Emperor," Quartelva replied, his voice taking on a heavy, rhythmic cadence that matched the tolling of a bell. "But to truly parse the depth of the integration, you must look at their own biological history, to a parasitic event so ancient it is encoded in their very cells. They call it the endosymbiotic theory. It describes a time when one single-celled organism didn't consume another, but merged with it, becoming a permanent, essential subroutine. They call this former intruder the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. The host didn't lose its life. It gained a source of energy it could never have generated on its own. But in that gain, it lost its status as a solitary entity. It became something else, a partnership, a symbiosis, a hybrid. This is the template for the human superorganism, my Emperor. They aren't looking to rule you. They are looking to become your mitochondria. The Emperor's eyes narrowed as the biological metaphor sank into his mind, the sheer, invasive scale of it causing a shudder to ripple through his frame. "They want to provide the energy," he murmured, his voice hushed and heavy with the realization, "while they control the output. They want to be the engine within our own machine." "Precisely, my magnificence," Quartelva confirmed, his hands tracing a complex, interconnected pattern in the air. "They want to make themselves so vital to our survival, so integrated into our logistical and social stacks, that the thought of rejecting them is equivalent to biological suicide. They aren't interested in the titles of kings or the borders of maps. They are interested in the flow of energy, the exchange of data, and the long-term viability of the network. They are a species that has mastered the art of becoming indispensable. They arrive as guests, they stay as friends, and they end as the very air you breathe. The Emperor returned to his chair, the weight of his robes feeling like a leaden shroud. He looked at the Chief Intelligence Officer, his voice barely a whisper against the silence of the vault. And what of the sovereign? What of the man who sits upon the throne and believes himself the master of his own fate? Quartelva took a final, slow sip of his liquor, the iridescent liquid catching the last of the firelight. The sovereign becomes a legacy system, my emperor, he said, the words flat and final. A cherished, ceremonial piece of hardware that continues to run the old commands, while the real processing, the real power, has migrated to the human integrated core. You remain the emperor, but you are an emperor fueled by their energy, governed by their idioms, and protected by their suicidal fury. You are, in every sense that matters, a guest in your own empire. The room lapsed into a profound, suffocating silence. Grixnar stared into the middle distance, his optics tracing the jagged edges of the shadows as he processed the terminal nature of the human interaction. He realized that his entire history, the thousands of years of expansion and dominance, was merely a precursor to this biological inevitability. It is not a choice they make, my emperor, Quartelva added, his voice low and devoid of judgment. It is not a policy, a manifesto, or a decree. It is their nature. They are not a single organism. They are a sprawling, multi-species collaboration masquerading as a biped. At their most fundamental level, they are a colony. They house trillions of alien bacteria in their gut, in their skin, and in their very cells. They have spent millions of years refining the art of cooperation with the other. To them, adding another species to their superorganism is not an act of conquest. It is simply the next stage of growth. The Emperor looked up, his expression a mask of weary, intellectual curiosity. So, you are suggesting that they cannot help themselves? That their very biology is a colonial engine that seeks to assimilate everything it touches? Precisely. They adopt local life forms as family members. They modify their own environment to suit the needs of their symbionts. They call it cooperation, but it is the most effective form of expansion ever indexed. They don't need to break your walls if they can convince you to build their hearth in your living room. And now, Quartelva sighed, the sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. We have been detected by the sensors. We are the latest candidate for integration. And your professional assessment, Quor? Grixnar asked, his voice steadying. He was no longer a man fighting a war. He was a man reviewing the specifications of a new, unavoidable operating system. Quartelva finished his drink, the click of the glass against the table sounding like the closing of a tomb door. Of the paths available, my emperor, the fire of their wrath or the honey of their friendship, the choice is binary. To resist is to ensure the total erasure of our census. To accept is to survive as a component of something vastly more powerful, even if it means the end of our isolation. We will be safer, we will be more prosperous, and our people will be happier. But we will no longer be ours. If you were anyone else, I would have you tried and executed for treason for such words, the Emperor said, though his voice lacked the sharp edge of a threat. It was a hollowed-out rasp, the sound of a man who had seen the bottom of the galaxy's final well. He finished his drink, the heat of it providing a momentary, flickering shield against the cold reality of the report. But I know the wisdom behind them. I have felt the gears of the palace grinding slower every year. I have seen the rot in the outer sectors. Perhaps we are not being conquered. Perhaps we are being rescued by a force that doesn't know how to do anything else. He paused, his gaze drifting toward the heavy, velvet shrouds that blocked out the stars, trying to visualize the future Quartelva had mapped. A future of prosperity, of safety, and of a total, soul-crushing loss of self. Quartelva remained still and silent, a statue of scarred hardware waiting for the command to execute or to fade. Finally, the Emperor looked back, his optics reflecting a hard, binary resolve. Very well, Grixnar commanded, his voice regaining a fraction of its imperial weight. Your new mission is to blueprint the integration. Find out how best to proceed with peaceful contact with their ambassador. Prepare a comprehensive list of protocols, the do's and don'ts of the human interaction, so we do not accidentally trip the toggle and switch them over to murder machine mode. I want this empire to be the most efficient mitochondria they have ever assimilated. Yes, my emperor. May you live forever. Good night. With these final words, delivered with a reverence that was both traditional and deeply personal, Cortelva performed a sharp, practiced bow that was as fluid as the shadows from which he had emerged. He stood up, his hooded form silhouetted for a heartbeat against the dim embers of the hearth, and then, with the same uncanny, predatory silence that had marked his arrival, he was gone. He did not retreat through the doors but seemed to dissolve into the very tapestries and velvet hangings of the room, leaving behind only the lingering scent of old parchment and the sharp, medicinal tang of the liquor. "Good night," the emperor whispered into the emptiness, his voice a solitary echo in the vaulted chamber. He stood alone amidst the ruins of his former certainty, the silence of the palace grounds now feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a void waiting to be filled. Slowly, his movements heavy with the accumulated fatigue of a lifetime of rule, he reached out and grasped the crystal decanter. He poured one final measure of the shimmering liquid, the sound of it splashing into the glass amplified by the stillness of the room. He placed the glass upon the table, adjacent to the empty chair where his advisor had sat, as if offering a silent toast to the ghost of the empire he had once known. This was, he realized with a pang of profound, localized grief, likely the final occasion upon which he would savor this particular vintage as a truly free and independent sovereign. Never again would he lift this glass as the absolute master of a powerful and ancient empire that stood alone and beholden to no one. Every sip from this moment forward would be flavored by the knowledge of the human superorganism, and the invisible threads of symbiosis that were already beginning to tighten around his throne. Yet, despite the sorrow, he sat and prepared to savor every last, iridescent drop, treating the act as a funeral rite for an age of isolation. He watched the light of the dying fire dance within the crystal, his mind drifting to the ambassadors who would soon arrive, to the trade deals that would be signed, and to the cat videos that would inevitably follow. He thought of the mitochondria, those ancient, microscopic conquerors, and wondered if they felt any triumph as they expanded their reach into the stars through the medium of their human vessels. He realized that the era of the great individual empire was coming to a close, replaced by a vast, biological tide that cared little for the boundaries of maps or the titles of kings. The emperor closed his eyes, the warmth of the liquor finally beginning to blunt the edge of his anxiety. He leaned his head back against the velvet, a weary pilot at the helm of a ship that had already been caught by the current. He understood now that resistance was not just futile, but a form of madness, a rejection of the very nature of life itself. The future was not approaching with the thunder of engines or the flash of lasers. It was arriving with the quiet, inevitable persistence of a growing forest. It was a future that demanded not a sword, but a handshake, not a fortress, but a home. The no future was coming, vast and unavoidable, and it wore a human smile.